One of my favorite things about video games is collecting items, like new equipment that you can use to help you in your journey. Whether that's a new weapon, new armor, just a tool to help you navigate the overworld or defeat monsters, whatever it could be. And that's part of why The Legend of Zelda is one of my favorite game series. Metroid is another big one. That is my favorite game series, but Legend of Zelda is one I want to talk about today. And there's a ton of Zelda games I can go through. Twilight Princess, for one, has a huge number of items, some of which are unique to that game. Ocarina of Time, it plays it a bit safer, but there's still new and exciting ways to use items from the 2D series. But the one I'm focusing on today is going to be A Link to the Past. Now, A Link to the Past, if I'm not wrong, has probably the most items out of any Zelda game. Maybe not necessarily unique items, but definitely probably the most. And there are some standout examples. So I'm just gonna go through them and talk about them and why I love them so much. You know. So the item you start out with is just the normal shield. Basic Zelda game thing. If a projectile comes from non-magical projectile comes from you, if you face it with your shield up, basically if you're not doing anything else, just standing still, the shield can block it. Okay, that's pretty good. Soon after, you'll get the lamp, which can't deal damage to enemies, but can light, torches or lamps or basic stuff like that. Basically, it is just completely a utility item. So it's completely fine, if you're just trying to light lamps, which is a common puzzle throughout the game. But you will get an item later that kind of supersedes it, especially since the lamp can't deal any damage. Soon after, you'll get the sword, level 1 sword, whatever. Swipe to deal damage to enemies, and unlike in previous Zelda games where you just stab the sword, in Link to the Past, you actually swing it in an arc. And so you actually have to kind of play around that for the whole game, because sometimes enemies will approach you, if this is the arm the sword is in, and this is the way Link is facing, sometimes enemies will come at it like this. And since Link is left-handed, you've got to think about that he'll swing the sword to the left in an arc. So if someone's on the right of him, you'll have trouble hitting them if they're coming at him from the right. So I feel like it does just add a lot of depth to the overall Zelda formula to have to think about, hey, my character can't swing this way. I have to face to the right to hit something that's coming at me from the right. It's a whole thing. So I think Link to the Past is where they got Zelda's swordplay in 2D down perfectly, and it shows because it kind of bled over into all the rest of the Zelda games. Except in future ones, Link just swings the sword in an arc in front of him instead of to the left like Link to the Past. And I'm not going to complain about that, Like, I think making the swordplay more accessible and easy to understand is good, but I just kind of miss when you had to strategize every time you got into a sword fight, which you did get to quite a lot in Zelda Link to the Past. Apart from that, there's a bunch of other items. You'll get the bow and arrow, and, the arrows didn't appear in Zelda 2, but in Zelda 1, instead of having an arrow counter, it just worked off your rupee counter, and I'm pretty sure I already brought it up, but I always thought of that as saying, okay, so the quiver costs 80 rupees, and every arrow you shoot, you just retroactively bought for 1 rupee each. It sort of made sense if you stretched your mind to it, but Link to the Past is the first Zelda game with an actual arrow counter at the top. There's rupees, bombs, arrows, and keys. And, so you've got arrows that you just collect from either smashing pots or defeating enemies, and then you can shoot them with the bow. And the bow's got a bit of a delay on it where Link has to load the arrow, nock it, and fire it. And again, just like the sword, it's not instantaneous. Like, you can't just shoot arrows willy-nilly. You've got to think about, okay, am I the right distance away from the enemy? How long will the arrow take to reach them? Will they move out of the way? So it was a whole great thing. I think they got the arrows and the sword right. Another item you get is bombs. It's pretty similar to the bombs in Zelda 1, except in this game you're able to pick up bombs, because that was the new big thing called the past, picking up items. You can pick up pots, shrubs, rocks, bombs, and throw them. And if you threw the bomb, it gave it a bit more combat ability, where it wasn't, oh, the enemy has to be right in front of me for the bomb to go off. So you could set a bomb, pick it up, throw it at the enemy, retreat, and put some serious distance between you and an enemy. And it's not always perfect because, the button you use to pick up bombs, that being the A button, is really a button you're going to use a lot throughout the game. Notably for the item I'll talk about next, the Pegasus boots. Another new addition to Zelda 3. Basically, if you held down A, then Link will run in place for a moment, and then will zoom forward at a much faster speed. It was great for getting around the map, and when you did it, he'd hold his sword out in front of him. So if there was an enemy right in front of you, you could just Pegasus boot straight at them, deal a little bit of damage. I mean, it's good for taking out small enemies if you're just trying to get across the map, but in an actual combat scenario with a boss, for example, it's not super useful. But, bombs you just can either buy from the shop or, find in the overworld. Pegasus boots is your reward for beating Dungeon 1. Your sword you get in the intro dungeon. The bow is the treasure of Dungeon 1. Arrows, again, you find just as you adventure. The lamp you get in your house. The shield you start the game with. It's a whole thing. Zelda 3 was also the first Zelda game with bottles. You can collect 4 bottles in Link to the Past. And you can put a number of things. You can catch fairies with a new item, the bug net. You can catch bees, to wreak havoc on screen. There's a special bee called the Good Bee in one of the fairy fountains. It's actually pretty useful for dealing with one of the bosses. I believe the boss of Dungeon 3 Dark World. And you could also fill the bottles up with potions. There was the Water of Life, Water of Magic, and Cure All. Which did what they said. That was just a nice new addition. A bit tricky to navigate through the menu to get to, but you get the hang of it. Right. But like I said, bug catching net, that's another item. An interesting one is the shovel. So the shovel appears in a mini game in which you're digging up trying to find rubies, and it's also temporarily given to you by a boy in the forest in the Dark World who wants you to find his flute. And you don't have to just go and find the flute. You can just take the shovel and play the rest of the game with it. Digging up spots in the overworld, getting rubies, hearts, what have you. It's interesting, but after you find the flute, the shovel goes away permanently. But you kind of want the flute because the flute will allow you to do fast travel. Because when you first get it, it's just a normal flute. It's an ocarina. You just play it, whatever. But if you play it in front of the statue in the center of town in Kakariko Village, another new addition, then a bird will come out of the statue, and it will let you fast travel to 7 different locations in the light world. No, 8 different locations in the light world. I'm not so naive. Right. Let's see. Another temporary item is the magic mushroom. Now you can find that in the forest where you get the Master Sword, but when you first get it, it doesn't do anything. But you can trade it to an old witch, up near Zora's domain, and she will bring you some magic powder, which, is the first of these items to use up your magic meter. Because, again, magic meter not actually introduced in Zelda 3, it's actually a Zelda 2 thing. But the way it's used in Zelda 3 is actually how it can go on to be used in the rest of the series. Basically, you have unlimited magic powder as long as you have magic in your magic meter. You can sprinkle it on enemies to have certain effects. You can sprinkle it on places on the overworld, to unlock upgrades to your magic meter. You can can turn certain enemies into fairies. It's a little more of a situational item, but it's very useful. If you know how to use it. On the subject of things that use your magic meter, there is also the fire rod. And the fire rod is the treasure of Dungeon 3 Darkwood. And what it does is, cast it, shoots out a bit of fire that deals damage to enemies and can light torches. It kind of makes the lamp a little redundant, but, I'm wrong. The lamp actually also uses your magic meter, but it's a very minuscule cost. The fire rod takes a lot more magic to use, but given that it has combat abilities and can go from long range, whereas the lamp is very close range, I'd say it's worth it. Then there's its counterpart, the ice rod. The ice rod is actually not an optional item, because I do think you need it to defeat the boss of Dungeon 7 Darkwood. Dungeon 7 Darkwood. But you can just find it a little below Zora's Domain. You sort of have to do a loop around. And you'll find it in a secret cave. You have to blow up the bomb. But it pretty much does the same thing. I'm not clear if it does actual damage to enemies, but it will freeze them in place. And there's a special interaction you can do with another item, the magic hammer, where if you freeze an enemy and then hit them with the magic hammer, it'll instantly kill something. It's pretty cool, especially the Gibdos in Dungeon 3 Dark World. I'm bringing up a lot of Dungeon 3 Dark World, but it's important. Speaking of the magic hammer, that is the treasure of Dungeon 1 Dark World, and it's required to beat the dungeon in the game. It's actually required to leave the starting area of the Dark World. Otherwise, there's pretty much no way out. What it does is it's very short range. You can hit enemies to deal damage to them. Sometimes it'll shake the ground and knock enemies over. That'll let you access their weak points. You can also pound stakes into the ground. It can do a lot of stuff. It's useful. It's actually very nice. I don't find myself using it a lot for combat just because there are better options, but, what can you do? Another thing is the boomerang. So the boomerang, you find it in Hyrule Castle, and what it'll do is, it's pretty much exactly like its Zelda 1 counterpart. It'll stun enemies. Unlike in Zelda 1, I don't think you can re-stun the same enemy while it's still stunned. So you have to wait for them to get unstunned and, become vital again. And then you can boomerang. Basically in short range, hit an enemy, it will come back to you, you can throw it again. A pretty simple item, but very useful throughout the whole game. Especially against enemies like Hinoxes and whatnot. You can also still pick up items like in Zelda 1, so keep that in mind. Let's see. There is the Magic Cape, which you can get after getting the treasure of Dungeon 4 Dark World. You find it in the graveyard, you go through a little path, knock down some things blocking your way, and you can open a chest to find the Magic Cape. So what it'll do, it'll make you completely invincible, invulnerable, and invisible until your magic meter runs out where you turn the cape off. And so what it'll do is it'll let you pass through any enemy or obstacle without taking any damage, any knockback, no nothing. And it's actually instrumental to getting a piece of heart, I believe, because it'll let you pass through the large blue bumpers without getting bumped back. So that's useful. The problem is it uses up a lot of magic, and so you don't need the magic cape to get it, but it's highly recommended that you have the magic cape to get the next item, the Cane of Birna, or the Cane of Birna. It's not really clear. No one ever said it in but you find it on Death Mountain after this long hallway of spikes that you're expected to have the magic cape to get through. But you can just damage boost through if you have some fairies or potions, right? What it does, it'll surround you with this glowing mote of light. I think the mote can deal damage to enemies, but basically you're invincible. And it'll take up less magic than the magic cape, but you can't pass through obstacles like bumpers or large spikes. And I don't know. It's good for, boss fights better than the magic cape because you can't attack while the magic cape is active. But but you can while the Cane of Mirna is active. So they're kind of the same thing, but the cape is more useful for puzzles, and the cane is more useful for combat, you know? But no, so that item from Dungeon 4 Dark World that I talked about that you need to get the cape in the first place is the Titan's Bit, which is actually the upgrade to the treasure of Dungeon 2 Light World, which is the Power Glove. The Power Glove will let you pick up rocks, throw them. Whatever. It's cool because, the picking up and throwing thing, like I said, is a new Zelda 3 thing. So the Power Glove lets you pick up rocks, pick up large rocks, basically light gray rocks can be picked up with the Power Glove. And the treasure of Dungeon 4 Dark World, which is the Titan's Bit, lets you pick up the dark colored rocks and throw them. It's a little underwhelming, but it's still fun, and it opens up a lot of new pathways. On the subject of upgrades, there are also 2 returning items from Zelda 2, those being the Magical Boomerang and the Magical Shield. Both of these can be found by finding a secret fairy fountain and throwing in the Boomerang and the Shield respectively. And they pretty much do the same thing they did in Zelda 1. Magical Boomerang now goes faster and further, but apart from that, just the normal Boomerang, and the Magical Shield can now block magical projectiles like from Zoras or Wizrobes. No, it can't block Wizrobes, because that would come with the treasure of Dungeon 7 Dark World, which is the Mirror Shield, which not only blocks all magical projectiles, but also reflects some of them. So a Wizrobe's blast can now be reflected with your Mirror Shield. Eye lasers on the wall can be reflected with the Mirror Shield. It's fun. But honestly, it is probably the least, exciting upgrade in the game for me. But it's still nice to be able to block pretty much everything. Other upgrades are, so there's the level 1 sword that you get at the beginning of the game. Then there's the Master Sword that you find in the Lost Woods. You have to beat dungeons 1, 2, and 3 Light World. Once you get all of those, then you can go to where the Master Sword is hidden. Use the pendants to take it out from the pedestal, and that's the level 2 sword. After completing Dungeon 4 Dark World, you can pick up some dark-colored rocks, save a little guy from the Dark World, and bring him back to his brother. And they're both little gnome guys, and they offer to temper your sword for a bit. And so you'll give them your sword, which you'll be completely swordless for a while. And they say just come back in a while. All you have to do is go to the Dark World and then to the Light World, and it'll be done. So after you use the magic mirror, the sword is done tempering. It's a whole thing. But once you do that, you'll get the level 3 sword, which will deal even more damage. And then at the end of the game, after you beat Dungeons 5 and 6 Dark World, then you can buy this giant ball, and you can go up to the pyramid in Dark World, go to this cracked entrance spot, and blow it up with the giant bomb, and you'll find another fairy fountain that's a lot like the one where you got the magical shield and magical boomerang. And there you can throw in not only your bows and arrows to get the silver arrows, which you need to beat the game, but also your sword, which will turn into the golden sword, which is the level 4 sword final upgrade, and it'll deal the most damage out of all of the swords. Note that you don't need to get the tempered sword to get the golden sword, but it's just highly recommended that you do. Let's see. Other items. There's also the Book of Budora, which you need the Pegasus boots to get. You knock it off a shelf in Kakariko Village. It's not super useful, but you need it to get a few items and also to enter Dungeon 2 Light World. And it'll also let you read some secret lore bits written in ancient Hyrulean. It's a whole thing. It just kind of sits there in your inventory the rest of the game, though. But speaking of things that you can get with the Book of Budora, there are 3 medallions. There is the Bombos medallion, which you find on a cliff overlooking the Hyrule Desert. You need the Book of Budora to get it. What it does is it basically does a screen. Everything on screen will take fire damage and be lit on fire and probably die. It'll help melt ice. It's actually very useful against the boss of Dungeon 5 Dark World. there's the Ether Medallion, which you also need the Book of Medora and the Master Sword to get. I think for both the Bombos Medallion and the Ether Medallion, you need the Master Sword and the Book of Medora. But so the Ether Medallion gravestone's next to Dungeon 3 Light World, right? Next to Dungeon 3 Light World. And what it does, it's the same thing, it's a screen nuke, but this time it's lightning damage. And it's required to get into Dungeon 6 Dark World. So it's cool, but not as cool as Bombos. And then thirdly, there's the Quake Medallion, which is in the Dark World. It's on an area that's sort of underneath, the Zora's domain of that area. You need to throw a rock into a circle of wooden planks. And once you do, this fish will pop out, go like, leave me alone. And he'll say, if I give you this, will you leave me alone? And he'll give you the Quake Medallion. So what the Quake Medallion does is any enemies that are not flying, it'll deal like a ton of damage to them. Honestly, Quake is my least used one, but you do need to use the Quake Medallion to get into Dungeon 7 Dark World, as well as the Magic Hammer, but who's counting? And the Titan's Might, but who cares? But no. So let's see, there's also the Moon Pearl, which is the treasure of Dungeon 3 Light World. And what it does is it'll let you go into the Dark World without turning into a rabbit. And you pretty much can't do anything as a rabbit besides travel between light and dark worlds. So you kind of need the Moon Pearl, otherwise you're just stuck and you can't play the rest of the game. Speaking of going from Dark World to Light World, there's also the Magic Mirror, which when used so it can be used at any time in the Dark World to go to the Light World, but it can't bring you from the Light World to the Dark World. What it does is, once you're in the Dark World and you use the Magic Mirror, it'll create a little sparkly portal that once you step back on it, you'll go back to the Light World. There are also a bunch of portals all over the Light World that take you to the Dark World, and you can use those to go back and forth, but the Magic Mirror is important for some dungeons, some puzzles, some pieces of art. It's a whole thing. So you get that from an old man as you're going up to Light World Dungeon 3. And it's basically required, you can't skip it. And another useful thing it does is that if you're inside the dungeon, if you use the Magic Mirror, you can go back to the entrance of the dungeon, automatically. It's useful. Let's see, there's also the Flippers, which you can buy in Zora's domain for, I believe, 300 rupees, possibly 500, I'm not sure. But what they do is they allow you to jump into the water without drowning. And they let you swim around, and they're required to be in Dungeon 2 Dark World, I believe. Yeah. But I don't think they're required before that. Speaking of Dungeon 2 Dark World, the treasure of that dungeon is the Hookshot, which actually appeared first here and not in Ocarina of Time. What it does is it fires out this hook, right? It can hurt small enemies, stun them for a bit, so it's kind of like a miniature boomerang, but you are locked in place while you're using it. So, I don't know, I wouldn't say it's as useful for stunning enemies, but it can also pick up items, it can latch onto stones and pull you across gaps. I'd say it's less useful for combat than the boomerang, but it's much, much more useful for navigation, So apart from that, there's also the Cane of Somaria, which is the treasure of Dungeon 6 Dark World. And what it does is it'll let you create a block, basically, that you can push around. You might be able to pick it up, I think. But basically, you just create a block, and you can use it to press down buttons, block enemies, do a bunch of stuff. And if you activate it again while the block is on screen, then it'll explode into some projectiles that can deal damage. I've honestly never used it to deal damage, and this will use magic, so you gotta watch out for that. I don't know, it's fun, and if you do Dungeon 6 Dark World before Dungeon 5 Dark World, then it'll let you skip a really important puzzle, so I always recommend doing Speaking of Dungeon 5 Dark World, see, there, the treasure of that dungeon is the blue mail returning from Zelda 1. Basically, you find it in Dungeon 5, and it'll reduce all damage you take by 1/2. So, great. And the upgrade to that is in, I believe the upgrade to that is in Dungeon 8 Dark World. Yes. Yeah. So the upgrade to that is in Dungeon 8 Dark World. It's the red mail, of course, and it'll reduce all damage by 1/4. Let's see. That's always a good thing to have. What other items are there? Right, shot, magic items. But no, yeah, I suppose that's it. Um, yeah. So, just mostly what I like about it is that every item is useful throughout the whole game. Like, there's never a point where you're like, oh, well, this is just useless. Like, the boomerang might have been useless if, as soon as you got the hook shot, if it wasn't for the magical boomerang, you know? Um, Bombs never stop being useful. The fire rod and ice rod, kind of, they're cool, you know? If you're looking to deal with enemies from long range with a very fast projectile. Because, like I said, the arrows take some time to wind up, but they're so good. The sword is always useful. The medallions are probably the least useful combat-oriented ones, but they're still useful for solving puzzles. And you know what? That's great. You know? And some of them are useful against certain bosses. Basically what I'm trying to say is every item gets its chance to shine in Zelda 3. And I think that's super important. I feel like more games should be like that, where there's just so many items, but there's use for all of them. Some games have a small number of items, but there's some that are just so much more useful than others. Some games have a lot, but only a few of them are actually good, and most of them are just filler. With Link to the Past, I feel like every item I used at least once, probably multiple times, and said, that felt great. So, no, that's my thing. I just wanted to talk about the items in Zelda 3 and just go through them. Have a good time. But, yep, that's about it for today. See you.